The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to John. Jesus said to his disciples, "As the Father loves me, so I also love you. Remain in my love. If you keep my commandments, you will remain in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commandments and remain in his love. I have told you this so that my joy may be in you and your joy might be complete. This is my commandment: love one another as I love you. No one has greater love than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends. You are my friends if you do what I command you. I no longer call you slaves, because a slave does not know what his master is doing. I have called you friends, because I have told you everything I have heard from my Father. It was not you who chose me, but I who chose you, and appointed you to go and bear fruit that will remain, so that whatever you ask the Father in my name, he may give you. This I command you: love one another." The Gospel of the Lord. Our passage today from the Gospel of John actually continues what we heard last week. These are all selections from what's been called the farewell discourse of Jesus at the Last Supper. In other words, his final words to his disciples at that Last Supper before he's going to go out into the garden and begin his passion, death, and resurrection. Now, in the midst of what Jesus says quite a bit here about love in today's passage, there was one sentence that grabbed my attention. The sentence was this: "I no longer call you slaves, because the slave does not know what his master is doing. I've called you friends." I no longer call you slaves. Slaves. The apostles, those at the Last Supper, would have been quite familiar with the idea of slaves and slavery. It's estimated that from 1/4 to 1/3 of the population of the Roman Empire, in which Jesus and his apostles lived at that time, would have been slaves. Whenever the Romans conquered a particular territory, they would enslave part of the population, and of course their families and descendants would also be slaves unless they were freed at some particular point. In fact, this was so common that everybody presumed that slavery was a normal part of human society. In fact, if you read the letters of St. Paul, he presumes this. He'll even talk about the duties that a Christian slave owes to his master, or a Christian master owes to his slaves. Now, I suspect, though, that the word slaves caught my attention because I admit it, I'm a Civil War buff. You know, whenever a new book about the Civil War, or there's a new television program about the Civil War, it sparks my interest. And of course, before I came back here in 2000, I had spent 6 years in Clemson, South Carolina, and that, of course, is the state where the rebellion began. In fact, down there I learned that, well, no, it wasn't really the Civil War, it was the War of Northern Aggression. But in any case, we happened to be in Vero Beach, Florida during the month of March, and I came upon an independent bookstore, and there in this store was a book called General Lee's Army by Joseph Guthar. And the book was interesting because he had many selections from letters. He had access to letters written by many of the soldiers in the Army of Northern Virginia, the chief Confederate military force. And these letters were very fascinating as the soldiers told about their experiences and their feelings and all that, expressing these to their families and loved ones back home. But among the interesting comments there were comments about what had been called the peculiar institution. The peculiar institution. The United States, as you probably know, was the last civilized country to sanction institutional slavery. And among the comments from these soldiers were complaints about their slaves. They said these slaves should be loyal to us because they were better fed, better housed, better treated than they would have been in Africa. In fact, here they had access to Christianity and to civilization. And yet, as they complained, whenever a Union army came close, these people would escape and cross the line to freedom on the Union side. In fact, at one interesting conversation I remember reading is that one of the officers was just really going on and on about how well his slaves were treated. One of the others said to him, "Yeah, but would you want to be one? Would you want to be a slave?" Now, I bring this all up because I think there's a rather common opinion in our country, in our society today, that to be a Christian, and I think especially to be a Catholic, is effectively to be a slave, okay? If you're a Catholic, okay, you're bound by rules, traditions, regulations, guilt, hang-ups. You take orders from people on high, various church officials and so forth. You're basically a slave. But notice what Jesus says in today's gospel: you are not slaves, you are my friends. And then he goes on to describe what it means to be his friends. First of all, he says, I want you to have joy. I've told you this so that my joy may be in you and your joy may be complete. And what he says to his apostles and disciples at the Last Supper, he's saying to us. He goes on to say, furthermore, I want you to have a sense of being chosen. Chosen. It's a wonderful line, the end of our second reading today, from the first letter of St. John, where he says, not that we have loved God, but that he loved us first. God has taken the initiative. He has loved us. He has chosen us. We are his friends. A generation or so, Jesse Jackson used to gather African-American kids, maybe in a school or a church, and tell them that you are somebody. And you would get them to stand up and shout out, I am somebody. Really, that's what's being said here. You are somebody.